Old Testament, and you're going to say, what in the world, Book of Samuel? Well, you'll find out a little bit about why I said that in this little video clip. First of all, it just introduces the Book of Samuel. Now, no sound. Don't know how. Can we stop it and reverse it?
He made a covenant with God in Mount Sinai, and eventually came into the promise. And there, Israel was supposed to be faithful to God. The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. There are two separate books in our modern Bible, but that division is due simply to scroll length. It was originally written as one coherent story.
One book.
We're just going to cover the book of 1 Samuel in this video. So after Israel was rescued from slavery in Egypt, they made a covenant with God at Mount Sinai and eventually came into the promised land. And there Israel was supposed to be faithful to God and obey the covenant commands. Before the book of Samuel, Judges showed how Israel failed at that task big time. It was a period of moral chaos and assumption. God allows Israel to lose the battle and the ark is stolen. So the Philistines, they take the ark and they place it in the temple of their god, Dagon. And then the God of Israel defeats the Philistines and the god Dagon without an army by sending plagues on the people. And then the Philistines don't want the ark anymore, obviously, and they send it back to Israel. And the point of this little story seems to be this. God is not Israel's trophy, and he opposes pride among the Philistines, but also among his own people. And so Israel needs to remain humble and obedient if they want to experience God's covenant blessing, which opens up into the next large section. The Israelites come to Samuel, and they say, hey, we want a king like all the other nations have. Go find one for us. And so Samuel, he's kind of ticked off, and he goes to consult with God. And God says, yes, their motives are all wrong, but if a king is what they want, give them one. And so we're introduced to the figure of Saul. Now, Saul is a tragic figure because he begins full of promise. He's tall, he's good-looking, he's a perfect candidate for a king. But he has deep character flaws. He's dishonest, he lacks integrity, and he seems incapable of acknowledging his own mistakes. And so these flaws become his downfall. He wins some battles at the beginning, but his flaws run so deep, he eventually disqualifies himself by blatantly disobeying God's commands. And so the aging Samuel confronts Saul and Israel. He had warned the people that they would only benefit from a king who's humble and faithful to God. Otherwise, the kings of Israel will bring ruin. So he informs Saul that God is going to raise up a new king to replace him. And so Saul's downfall begins. As God, at the same time, is working behind the scenes to raise up that new king. It's an insignificant shepherd boy named David. He's the least likely candidate to be king. But the famous story of David and Goliath shows that God's choice of David is not based on his family status, but simply on his radical and humble trust in the God of Israel. And so this story embodies all of the themes of Hannah's poem. Proud Saul and Goliath are brought low, while humble David is exalted. From here, we watch Saul slowly descend into madness, while David rises to power. So David starts working for Saul as a general, and he's winning all of the battles, and he's also winning all of the fame. And so Saul gets jealous, and he starts chasing David around, hunting him, trying to kill him. David's done nothing wrong. And so David simply runs and waits in the wilderness. And here we see David's true character. He has multiple opportunities to kill Saul, but he doesn't. He simply trusts that despite Saul's evil, God will raise up a king for his people. What's interesting, too, is that many of the poems of David that you find in the book of Psalms are linked to this very period of his life. And they all express the same attitude of trust. And so this section of the book ends with Saul coming to a grisly death after losing a battle with the Philistines. 1 Samuel tells some of the most intricate, well-told stories you find anywhere in the Bible. And the characters Saul and David, they're portrayed very realistically. And the author's putting them forward as character studies so that you can find yourself in them. So in Saul's story, we see a warning. It's crucial that we reflect on our own character flaws and how they harm us and other people. And with God's help, we need to humble ourselves and deal with our dark side. Saul's story doesn't become ours. David, on the other hand, is presented as an example of patience and trust in God's timing in our lives. And so he's running in the wilderness, being chased by Saul. David had every reason to think that God had abandoned him. But that's not what he thinks. And so David's story encourages us to trust that despite human evil, God is working out his purposes to oppose the proud and to exalt the humble. And that's what 1 Samuel is all about.
All right. Little exciting book there. Now let's see if I can get started on this other part. So we see a theme, if you see, humility and pride. Do you see that over and over and over again? We'll be seeing that when I said the book of Samuel. Now you know why I said the book of Samuel instead of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. It was one book, but we have it divided in our Bible into 1 and 2 Samuel. And did you catch why they divided it? Too long. Yeah, it's not like, scroll with your... Okay, no, these are, roll, can you imagine that you're trying to look at something near the beginning of 1 Samuel and then you got to roll it to the other end? Okay, all right. So here we have in the book of Samuel, as I call it there, so that's why we named like that. Let me see, it's not this button. All right, where's the button to push? Not this one. Okay. All right, so the book of Samuel, similar to the book of Acts, was a bridge point between the judges and this covenant relationship with God that we saw in the earlier part. And here's these kings and what's going on with the kings. Now, if we didn't have Samuel in the book of Kings, we'd be sitting there saying, why are all these people being hauled off to Babylon and what's going on here? And there'd be a bit of confusion about what in the world's taking place here. So this was a little bit of a bridge relationship with talking about the covenant relationship that used to be under the judges. And during the time of the judges, you had, of course, men that rose up to rescue Israel during a trial time. Now, in our language or our thinking, when I say, what do you think of when you hear of a word of a judge? Well, are you not thinking of a courtroom and this and that? And say, I don't see any judge in the book of Judges. What you see is men that are basically rescuing, people, Israel from their enemies. That's what you're seeing, and they're calling them judges. But but in our thinking, these were rescuers, if you may say, that rescued them from the enemies. And we've gone through the book of Judges earlier. Why was there enemies? What caused the problem to start with? Anybody remember? Everybody doing what's right in their own eyes, and they start to look away from God, and what do they look to? Themselves, and to idols too. Okay, one thing you'll find through the Bible is that God does not tolerate worship of anything other than himself.
God's power. But in the other 40 years when they reigned or when they were active, what they basically did was resolve disputes. People would bring them their disputes, right. So-and-so's has moved the boundary markers, or so-and-so has stolen my cow. So for most of their tenure, they were actually just dispute resolvers. They weren't really leaders like the king would be.
Okay, that's right. So, dispute resolvers. Okay. So, here we talk about the judges. Okay, then, so we find that throughout this time of Israel basically doing what's right now in the slow decay of worshiping God to setting up these idols from these foreign nations, falling into that decay, then being rescued out of that by a judge and set back on the course and whatnot. Well, the judge dies, and all right, they go back to their old ways again. And that's continued on and on and on through the book of Judges. And so they really needed some kind of a leader that would direct them in a continuous I'm trying to put this into a little bit of a thinking. When Joshua crossed the Jordan River to come into the Promised Land, that was around 1400 BC. So we talk about 300 years there of this time. The United States has been here not quite 300 years, but if you look back to 300 years ago, basically South Carolina was basically a colony established by the king overseas there, and they put a governor over here, and so that was like 300 years ago. Okay, we think of 1776, of the start before the American Revolution. Well, that'll be the 300 years in 2076. So get you an idea of a time comparison of how long they were in that land and during that time that they had this relationship. So we find this theme: God opposes the proud and exalts the humble. We find that theme over and over again throughout the book of Samuel, and I guess we'll see it continued on in the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings. If we go that route, I don't know if we will or not, but sometime in the next 20 years we'll get through those. But that's a theme that we find. And we find even in the New Testament, if you think about it, you see that carried on in a lot of situations in the New Testament. Now, what should our pride be in? Ourselves? What should it be in? It should be in the Lord. Does the Lord want anything else besides himself to be worshiped? No. So this pride actually becomes a part of setting God aside and putting something else in his place. You see, and that's why it's so detrimental and very important that we exercise that humility towards God, and we allow him to take first place in our lives. So we see that Samuel here is the key leader and kingmaker here in the first part of the book. And even though the focus turns from Samuel to Saul to David, but Samuel is the bridge all the way through those early kings there. And he's the one that ushered in that time and directed people towards that. So let's see. Of course, during his time, he had Saul, as we see. Was Saul God's first pick or choice? Why did they get Saul instead of David first? We want our way. You know, I find that in life, you want something bad enough that you're willing to go your own way, God is gentleman enough to step aside and let you go your own way. And when you go your own way, don't be surprised if you get the results of your own way. Okay? And it happens over and over again. You want to set yourself up as your own king? I want my life my way, my way. You know, it's going to cost you a little bit more than you expected, and you're going to stay there a little bit longer than you expected to stay. You know, sin has a way of doing that. Okay, so that's what we see there. course, then we go to the David's exciting rise to power. You know, David and Goliath. Yeah, just about every kid hears that story, and it gets distorted in different ways, and people pull some unbiblical ideas from that. But it's an exciting time in the book there. But now we get to Hannah in chapter 1, and I'm going to read what I have here. I know it'd be a little different version than you have, but I like this. There was a man named Elkanah who lived in Ramah in the region of Zuph in the hill country of Ephraim. He was the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu of Tohu, the son of Zuph of Ephraim. Elkanah had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah did not. And each year, Elkanah would travel to Shiloh to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of heaven's armies at the tabernacle. The priests of the Lord at that time were the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. And on the days that Elkanah presented his sacrifice, he would give portions of meat to Peninnah and to each of her children. And though he loved Hannah, he would give her only one choice portion because the Lord had given her no children. So Peninnah would taunt Hannah and make fun of her because the Lord had kept her from having children. And year after year it was the same. Peninnah would taunt Hannah as they went to the tabernacle. And each time Hannah would be reduced to tears and would not even eat. "Why are you crying, Hannah?" Elkanah would ask. "Why aren't you eating? Why be downcast because you have no children? You have me. Isn't that better than 10 sons?" And then she goes on into a prayer. But here we see a time of difficulty for Hannah. And Hannah, of course, was in a family of good social standing. It gives you the genealogy and where they come from and all like that. It wasn't a bunch of scoundrels, but it was a decent, upright family. Now, these names, you're not going to look and find them other places in the Bible. It's like, oh yeah, this comes from there, comes from there. You're not going to see that. But obviously, by the way it's written there, you can see that, hey, you come from a pretty decent family here. So they had pretty good social standing. Obviously, they had to have moderate wealth. Now, in verse 2, it does talk about him having a second wife. And you go, whoa, wait a minute now. We don't go polygamy. And that's the way that some of them did. God never condoned that. It did take place in the Old Testament with a number of people. Obviously, for somebody to be able to do that, they had to have enough wealth basically to operate two families, if you might say. Also, in those days, to survive, you had to have lots of children farming the fields and bringing things in and working together to be able even to survive. So it was quite of a different society of that day versus this day. And any time you have a family with a split situation, you're always going to have problems. And you and I, we both know of families where they're on their second marriage, and then there's that conflict of the first and the second and whatnot. It's a problem from the get-go. Okay, so that's something I just thought I'd point out. But obviously he had to have a certain amount of wealth in order to be able to do that. So Hannah basically had a good family, as far as, reputation, stuff like that, moderate wealth, you can see in verse 3, her husband was regular in worship. Notice he went up to the temple to bring a sacrifice every year. He followed the Passover and these different feasts and all whatnot. So he was faithful in that, and that is something that a woman would obviously love to desire to see her husband be spiritually minded, of wanting to do what's right in his life and being careful to follow the law and do what's right. So those are some good positive things. And okay, in verse 5 and verse 8, we see that he showed a genuine affection towards her. And though he loved Hannah, he would give her only one portion because the Lord had given her no children. He didn't have to give her a portion there. He didn't want to have any children, but he gave her anyway because he was really, really concerned for her. Let's see, in verse 8, why are you crying, Hannah? Why aren't you eating? Why are you downhearted just because you have no children? You have me. Isn't it better than having 10 sons? So he was compassionate to her and said, look, I'm trying to do everything I can to be the kind of man that you want to be in your life. And I'm providing for you. I'm being kind to you. I'm being careful with you. And if he didn't care, go back and cry somewhere else. But he wanted to listen to her. He cared about what she was going through. So obviously, she had pretty much everything in life that any woman would want to have. The problem was that she was barren. Now, that in that day and age, the same reason we talk about wives and children, this was a problem. You become a weight to the family rather than a help to the family. We need some guys out there taking care of the fields and bringing in the water and doing the work. And, you're a weight to the family rather than a help to the family. And that was a disgrace in that day and age to be barren and just basically go along with that. So that was a difficulty problem that really came to bear in this chapter, and we'll see results of that, of course, with her crying, with her being depressed and going through those difficulties. And obviously, everybody around her wasn't going through that same difficulty. You don't understand what I'm going through. Ever heard of people say that? Okay. Well, there's Hannah going through that. Let's look at Genesis 11:30 and Genesis 21:3. I wonder if somebody could read Genesis 11:30 and somebody else read Genesis 21:1-3. All right. Genesis 11:30. I see smiling folks. Anybody volunteer for that one?
Sarah was barren, she had no child.
All right. Now let's go to Genesis 21:1-3.
Then the Lord took notice Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore a son Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son, who was born to him, who Sarah bore to him, Isaac.
All right, so we see the beginnings of the nation of Israel, beginnings right there with Abraham, with his son Isaac. We also seen, if you look in the Old Testament through Abraham, you see pictures of Christ with taking Isaac and offering him as a sacrifice. Okay, pictures of Christ found with this son. So we can see that. Okay, next, Rebecca, Genesis 25:20-26. I know that's 6 verses there. So we'd like to read that, please.
read it.
Go ahead.
Genesis 25:20. And Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, and the sister of Laban, the Aramaic, and he was his wife, or she was his wife. Sorry about that. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she also was barren, and the Lord answered him, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. But the children struggled together within her, and she said, if it is so, why then am I this way? So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your wombs, and 2 peoples will be separated from your body. And one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. When the days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. Now the first came forth red all over like a hairy garment, and they named him Esau. Afterward his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them.
Right. Old couple, but here's a birth of 2 boys. Esau and Jacob. You know, how do you like to have a child when you're 60 years of age? All right. Jacob, later on, had his name changed. Does anybody remember what his name got changed to? Israel. All right. So obviously another foundational thing there. And obviously, if you read through the book of Genesis and you look at Jacob and the beginning of Israel and all like that, the faith of Jacob, we also can see pointing towards Christ as well in his life as well.
Compare the scriptures in Genesis, you find that Yitzhak, Isaac, married at age 40, and the twins were born at age 60, which means that the couple had been married for 20 years before the birth. That's a long time to wait for kids.
Okay, let's look at Genesis chapter 30. Genesis chapter 30, verse 1 and 22 and 24.
Then God remembered Rachel, and God gave speed to her and opened her womb. So she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. She named him Joseph, saying, may the Lord give me another son.
All right, so we see Rachel with barren, and God opened her womb, and she had Joseph. Now, Joseph obviously was key about leading Israel out of Egypt, and of course we see different aspects of where he reminds us of Christ in different aspects of his life too. Okay, so let's see. We're going to go to Manoah's wife in Judges chapter 13, verses 2 and 24.
There was a certain man of Zorah, of the tribe of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children. And in verse 24 says, and the woman bore a son, and called his name Samson. And the young man grew, and the Lord blessed him.
Okay, so here was one of the judges in the book of Judges, where God used him with overcoming their enemies at that time. Okay, let's look to one last one here, and Elizabeth Luke chapter 1, 5 through 7, and also verse 57. Putting y'all to work today, huh?
In the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. And he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. But they had no child, because Elizabeth was barren, and both were advanced in years. And then we're at verse 57. Now the time came for Elizabeth to give birth, and she bore a son.
Okay, and that son became known as John the Baptist. So here we have a barren woman bearing a child, John the Baptist. And if you know anything about John the Baptist, he was, in a sense, the kingmaker in the New Testament, announcing the arrival of our King of Jesus. So you see, by the way, Hannah with Samuel, the kingmaker, Elizabeth, John the Baptist, announcing the birth of Christ. And so I remember our pastor was talking about, if you look for Jesus in the Old Testament, you'll find him. Okay? And there's another shadow of take place. And by the way, whoever's going to do the chapter 2 in Samuel, if you compare that to the Magnificat that Mary gave, wow, where they look at the two things, you'll see that even those two basically are parallel type passages. So this was deliberate in the Old Testament, pointing to Christ. All right. Now, at the same time, she had a thorn in the flesh, as we saw, as we read earlier, verse 6 and 7, that Peninnah would taunt Hannah and make fun of her because the Lord kept her from having children. And of course, in verse 7, let's see, year after year, it was the same. She would taunt them as they went to the tabernacle each time. Just that picking and picking and picking and making fun of her on and on and on. And already with that split family situation, we already have a problem. And this became a real thorn for her. And, nobody liked getting picked on. Now, we could do it once or twice, but this year after year after year, and no children, being a drag to the family, being picked, that's terrible. A very hard time that she was going through. The distress that she felt, verse 7 and 8 of this time of each year. Verse 8 is on, why are you crying, Hannah? Why aren't you eating? Why be downhearted? So she was crying. She was downhearted, depression about this situation. It was overwhelming, and nobody understood. Yes?
I think going to the festivals together, whenever you read about it in the Bible, and it seems a very joyful thing, almost like a family reunion. Everybody's gathering, there was feasting. So it would be like a joyful time, like to us maybe a Thanksgiving gathering or a Christmas gathering. But for Hannah, there was no joy. And I think the fact that it was during a joyful time made the pain maybe even more.
Right. Very painful time. We find in Exodus 3:7, somebody like to read that verse, Exodus 3:7.
Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings.
Okay, so even though she didn't see it, God did see it. Those tears are all numbered. God knows when we go through things, whether other people know it or not. Here in Exodus 3, that God saw the affliction of the people. And did they realize it? No. They were under their slave owners. Okay, Psalm 142, 1 and 2. Let's look at that verse. 2 verses there.
I cry out to the Lord with my voice. With my voice to the Lord, I make my supplication. I pour out my complaint before him, and I declare before him my trouble.
Okay. And that's what we should do. And that's what we should do. Pour out our complaint to the Lord. You know, you don't think something's fair? Tell the Lord about it. Cry to the Lord about it. That's what Hannah did. So what was Eli doing during this time when she was praying and crying out? Well, you can see in verse 9, he was sitting by the post. He was in a position where he can listen. Once after the sacrificial meal at Shiloh, Hannah got up and went to pray, and Eli, the priest, was sitting at the customary place beside the entrance of the tabernacle. That was his job. He was there, and he was there in a position where he could hear her pray. You could see in verse 10 the anguish and weeping that she had. Hannah was in deep anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord. And then she made a vow in verse 11. And she made this vow, O Lord of heaven's army, if you'll look upon my sorrow, answer my prayer, give me a son, and I will give him back to you. He will be yours for his entire life as a sign that he has been dedicated to the Lord. His hair will never be cut. Now, this is the Nazirite vow that normally people would say they vow for themselves. Well, here's the case of a parent vowing for a child. Who else did that happen to? A barren woman. Do you remember? Isn't that with Samson? Okay, the same thing took place there. Gave them to the Lord. Okay, and here's a thing. You see how the Bible starts weaving people together. Okay, so she had this vow, and by the way, on it, we don't necessarily need to strike bargains with God. Hey, if you do this, I'll do that. Okay, God is not a genie or a magic something. Okay, if you do this, I'll do that. God doesn't do bargaining. But now God did answer her prayer. You know, even if she wasn't going to dedicate Samuel, God would have still answered her prayer. But God made her stick to it, by the way, and is a good thing too, because as a result, Samuel was in a position to be this kingmaker. So all this was in God's plan. But it may also have been that God wanted to see, are you going to get to the point in your life where you're humble enough that you're willing to give up that child? Just like Abraham with Isaac. Or you're willing to give up that child. Okay? And I think it's more of the willingness that maybe God might have been just waiting for that in her life, to get her down to that point where she would be broken to the point, says, I'll do anything. I'll give you anything. You see? And sometimes God does lead us that way, breaks us to the point where he wants to get us to a point where we are willing to give anything that God wants. We'll give up anything. We'll do anything for God. And very well, God may very well be waiting for that point. But let's look at Eli's response in verses 12 through 14. As she was praying to the Lord, Eli watched her, seeing her lips moving, but hearing no sound. He thought she had been drinking. Must you come here drunk? He demanded. Throw away your wine. So Eli, sitting there, passing judgment on this poor woman. Of anybody who should have been sensitive, it would have been him. You know, we'll find out later chapters, he had problems with his own kids of just overlooking their wicked ways, and here he's ready to condemn somebody else. And so here's poor Hannah with all this oppression, and even the priestess picking on her and not being there to help her. You think about that. But her response in verses 15 and 16, we see, "Oh no, sir," she replied. "I haven't been drinking wine or anything stronger, but I'm very discouraged, and I was pouring my heart out to the Lord." don't think that I'm a wicked woman, for I've been praying out of great anguish and sorrow. So she what was going on there and what was happening. And we see that Eli in verse 17 said, in this case, go in peace. May the God of Israel grant your request that you've asked him. And of course, she followed up with, oh, thank you, sir, she exclaimed. And she went back and began to eat again and was no longer sad. So we see that when God, when she trusted God here, when he says that God can answer your prayer, she trusted God. Now we know in the book of Hebrews they talk about people of faith, and there's other ones. Here's a woman of faith. She was in great anguish, weeping and whatnot, but she trusted the Lord that she turned right around and started eating. She wasn't eating earlier. She was greatly depressed, but she was going to trust God that God was going to answer her prayer. And she had a total about face on that. And so that's how, so in our lives, does that give us any ideas of how we should handle problems and difficulties and anguish and trust? Doesn't that give us some ideas of life? Okay. Any comments on that? No comments. Okay. So we can see that her prayer was answered, verse 18 through 20, which I just finished reading right there, that God did listen to her and did give her the answer to her prayer. And that is something that we've got to realize, that when we come to God, he is a prayer answering God. He understands our anguish. He understands our loneliness. He understands our depressions. And he also answers prayer too. All right, let's pray and we'll be dismissed. Lord, I ask you that you'll bless us and direct us today and help us apply the scripture to our lives. In your name, amen.